The winter of 1962 arrived in Las Vegas without ceremony, the way winter always arrived in the desert, not with snow or ice, but with a cold that came after dark and surprised people who had forgotten the desert could be cold. And Frank Sinatra sat in the corner booth of a restaurant called Piro's on East Sahara that he had been coming to for 4 years because the owner, a compact Neapolitan man named Archero, who had come to Las Vegas in 1954, understood that Frank Sinatra sometimes needed a table where no one would approach him, where the evening could pass without anyone requiring anything of him. And it was past 10 on a Tuesday in December, and the restaurant was quiet enough that Frank Sinatra could hear the conversation at the only other occupied table, two men in the middle of the room who were discussing something with the focused energy of a disagreement that had been going on for some time. And Frank Sinatra was not trying to listen, but the restaurant was small, and the men were not speaking quietly, and the conversation reached him the way conversations reach people who are sitting alone, without enough of their own thoughts to provide insulation against the thoughts of others. What Frank Sinatra heard, over the course of 20 minutes while he ate his dinner and drank his wine with the deliberate, unhurried attention he gave to meals when he was eating alone, was this. One of the men, who appeared to be in his mid-40s, and who wore the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who worked with his mind rather than his appearance, was explaining to the other man, who was younger, and who was listening with the specific attentiveness of someone being told something they had not asked to hear, that he had made an error in judgment 18 months earlier that had cost someone else a significant professional opportunity, and that the person he had cost this opportunity was a musician named Lawrence Dent, who had been a friend of the speaker's for many years, and who the speaker had recommended against for a position that Lawrence had been genuinely qualified for. And the speaker had recommended against Lawrence, not because Lawrence lacked the ability, but because the speaker had believed at the time that another candidate was slightly stronger, and had said so in a context where his opinion carried significant weight, and the other candidate had been hired and had failed within 6 months. And Lawrence Dent had not been reconsidered for the position because, by the time the other candidate failed, the position had been restructured, and the original opportunity was gone, and Lawrence was now working at a level significantly below what his abilities merited, not because of any failure of his own, but because of a judgment call made by his friend that had turned out to be wrong. The man telling this story was named Gerald Hatch, and Frank Sinatra did not know this yet because the name had not come up in the portion of the conversation Frank Sinatra had heard, and Frank Sinatra was not certain why he was paying such close attention to a conversation between strangers, except that the quality of the speaker's voice had a specific gravity to it, the gravity of genuine guilt rather than performed guilt. And Frank Sinatra had spent enough time around people performing guilt to recognize the real article when he encountered it. And the real article was sitting in the middle of Piro's at 10 in the evening telling a younger man about a professional mistake that had cost a friend an opportunity he deserved. And what the speaker was saying now was that he did not know how to make it right, that saying sorry to Lawrence was inadequate because sorry did not restore the opportunity that had been lost, and that he had been trying to find some action that was proportional to what he had done and had not yet found one. Frank Sinatra finished his dinner and sat with his wine and thought about what he had heard, and then he did something that he occasionally did when something he had observed seemed to require it, which was that he got up from his table and walked to the table in the middle of the room and stood beside it, and said to the two men, who looked up at him with the mixture of recognition and surprise that people directed at Frank Sinatra when he appeared unexpectedly in their proximity, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I heard some of what you were saying. My table is too close and you weren't whispering. I want to ask you something." Gerald Hatch, who was the older of the two men and who had been speaking, looked at Frank Sinatra with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: the recognition of who was standing beside his table, and the particular exposed quality of someone who has just been told that a private conversation has been overheard. And he said, "Of course, Mr. Sinatra." And Frank Sinatra said, "This musician you were talking about, Lawrence Dent, what does he play?" And Gerald said, "Piano. He's a pianist. One of the best I've heard. He should be recording. He should be touring at a significant level." And Frank Sinatra said, "Why isn't he?" And Gerald said, because 18 months ago I told the wrong person the wrong thing at the wrong moment. And Frank Sinatra said, what's his name again? And Gerald said, Lawrence Dent. He's in Los Angeles. He's teaching at a junior college. He was doing session work before. And Frank Sinatra said, is he good enough to work at the level he should be working at, or are you telling yourself he is because you feel guilty? And Gerald looked at Frank Sinatra for a moment and said, he's better than I am. He was always better than I am. And I teach at Juilliard. And Frank Sinatra said, I'll make some calls. And returned to his table and finished his wine and left $20 for Archero and walked out into the December desert cold without looking back at the table in the middle of the room where Gerald Hatch and his companion had stopped speaking entirely and were sitting with the specific silence of people who are not sure whether what just happened was real. Frank Sinatra made 4 calls the following morning from his suite at the Sands Hotel, and the calls were to people in Los Angeles who worked in the recording industry and who he knew were actively looking for musicians of a specific caliber. And Frank Sinatra described Lawrence Dent in each call using only what Gerald Hatch had told him plus Gerald's Juilliard credential as a reference point. Had said that he had heard about a pianist named Lawrence Dent from a faculty member at Juilliard who considered Lawrence exceptional, and that Frank Sinatra was passing this along because the people he was calling would know what to do with information like this better than Frank Sinatra would. And each person he called had said they would look into it. And Frank Sinatra had hung up after each call with the specific quality of attention, already moving elsewhere, that characterized his relationship to acts of this kind. Because the doing of a thing and the dwelling on the having done it were, in Frank Sinatra's understanding, 2 entirely separate operations, and he had little patience for the second one. Lawrence Dent received a call in January of 1963 from a producer at a recording label in Los Angeles who said that he had been referred by a mutual contact and wanted to know if Lawrence was available for session work. And Lawrence said yes, he was available, and the session work led to a regular booking that led to a recording credit that led to other bookings in the chain reaction manner of professional momentum when it finally begins to move in the right direction. And within 18 months, Lawrence Dent was working at the level Gerald Hatch had described when he told his story to the younger man in Pierrot's restaurant, was recording with significant artists, and being called for projects that matched his abilities. And Lawrence never knew precisely how this change in his professional circumstances had begun, because the chain of causation was dispersed across 4 phone calls made from a hotel suite in Las Vegas by a man Lawrence Dent had never met. And the producer who had called Lawrence in January had said only mutual contact, which was accurate without being specific. And the mutual contact in question was a conversation overheard in a restaurant by someone who had no particular obligation to do anything with what he heard. Gerald Hatch learned about Lawrence Dent's changed circumstances from Lawrence himself, who called Gerald in the spring of 1963 to say that things had turned around professionally and that he wanted Gerald to know. And Gerald had felt something complex in receiving this call, had felt glad for Lawrence and also guilty in a new way. Guilty that something good had happened for Lawrence through a mechanism Gerald had not been responsible for and could not take credit for. And Gerald had not said anything to Lawrence about the night at Pierrot's because he did not know the full story himself, had only the memory of Frank Sinatra standing beside his table and asking about Lawrence's instrument, and then saying, "I'll make some calls," and walking away. It was not until 1971 that Gerald Hatch learned what those calls had been, and he learned it not from Frank Sinatra, but from the producer who had first called Lawrence, who mentioned in passing during a conversation about the industry that he had been tipped to Lawrence Dent years ago by Frank Sinatra, who had called out of nowhere with a recommendation based on a Juilliard faculty reference. And Gerald had sat with this information for several days before calling Lawrence and telling him everything, told him about the restaurant and the overheard conversation and Frank Sinatra standing at the table asking what instrument Lawrence played. And Lawrence had listened to the entire thing and had been quiet for a long time afterward, and then had said, "He heard a stranger talking about me in a restaurant and made phone calls the next morning." And Gerald said, "That appears to be what happened." And Lawrence said, Did he know who I was before that night? And Gerald said, almost certainly not. And Lawrence said, he did all of that for someone he'd never heard of. And Gerald said, it seems so. And Lawrence was quiet again and then said something that Gerald wrote down and kept, which was that the most significant things that happened in a life were almost never the result of plans or intentions or the systems that were supposed to produce results, but were instead the result of strangers paying attention at unexpected moments, and then doing something with what they noticed instead of nothing, and that the gap between doing something and doing nothing in those moments was the gap between the world as it was and the world as it could be, and that Frank Sinatra, sitting in a corner booth at Piero's on a Tuesday in December, had been on the right side of that gap, had done the thing rather than the nothing, and that this was not a small distinction, but was in fact the only distinction that mattered when everything else was accounted for. Frank Sinatra played the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas for a residency in the spring of 1963, and did not think about Lawrence Dent during those performances, had not thought about Lawrence Dent since the morning he made the 4 calls, because the calls had been made, and the doing was done, and dwelling on the having done it was not something Frank Sinatra found useful, and the performances at the Sands that spring were received the way Frank Sinatra's performances were typically received, with the specific combination of attention and affection that he had been generating in rooms for 20 years. And afterward Frank Sinatra ate dinner, and drank bourbon, and talked to people he knew, and went to bed at an hour that would have alarmed most people and slept until noon. And the winter cold had long since lifted from the desert, and the spring air in Las Vegas had that particular quality of warmth without humidity that made early evenings on the Strip feel like a particular version of the world that only existed in that city in that season. And Frank Sinatra moved through all of it with the ease of someone in complete command of his circumstances, which he mostly was. And the 4 phone calls from December sat in his past among the thousands of other things he had done, and said, and decided over the course of a career that had now lasted long enough to contain multitudes. And Lawrence Dent was playing sessions in Lowe's Angels, and Gerald Hatch was teaching at Juilliard, and the younger man who had been at the table in Piero's had eventually become a music journalist who wrote a piece in 1978 about the night he had watched Frank Sinatra stand beside a table in a Las Vegas restaurant and ask a stranger what instrument his friend played, a piece that ran in a small music publication, and that very few people read at the time, but that was later included in an anthology of music writing, as an example of something the editor described as the specific texture of how things actually happened in the music industry, as opposed to how people believed they happened, which was through systems and structures and formal processes, when in fact they happened the way most things of consequence happen, through accidents of proximity, and the willingness of someone present to do something with what the accident revealed.